Marshall and Joel, this is Tom Piota. Want to congratulate you on your 5th anniversary of Feudal Future. I appreciate the opportunity in the past to be on and to discuss the future of work in STEM fields. Now more than ever, that's so important to discuss this as we transition our economy. So thank you for the service that you're providing. Thank you for the interesting podcast that you're providing, and wishing you all the best in the future.
Hi, this is Rob Kepp. I'm director of the Asia Pacific Geoeconomics and Business Initiative at Chapman University. Congratulations, Joel and Marshall, on the 5th anniversary of the Feudal Future podcast. As your audience members know, you guys do a great job of highlighting vital issues in society and economics. I've enjoyed listening to your segments and the chance to engage with you on air too. Well done, and best wishes for more to come.
The Feudal Future.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And Joel, this is a special one for us. We are celebrating our 5th season. Congratulations.
Oh, well, same to you.
And we're still vertical.
And to our producer, Angel de Leon, and to Manaz Ascari, who have been behind the scenes and not on camera, but essential to what we've been doing.
Well, it's been a hell of a ride, hasn't it?
Oh, God.
Oh, my God. Think about what we started this to do, right? Originally, we called it the Feudal Future podcast because your book, which is about the emergence of neo-feudalism, which sounds kind of academic, right? But the essence of that book was we're entering a new period of concentration of power that looks an awful lot like feudalism in the past. And gee, it's just too bad you were so wrong on all of those predictions.
Well, I guess not, because still a lot of people are interested in that topic. And if nothing else, the big change, I think, is that whereas, let's say, when we started, most oligarchs were predictably allied with the Democrats and progressives, now there's at least a small group but very powerful group that is on the other side, and that's certainly a big change.
Yeah, it is. What I thought it might be interesting is, so it's been 5 years. What are the big changes or the big trends that have extended themselves in ways that you hadn't anticipated over the last 5 years, as you see it?
Well, the first one I would go to is I never thought Donald Trump would get elected again. Mm-hmm. Not that, his prior to COVID, his presidency was probably fairly successful. I think had it not been for COVID, he would have been reelected. But after January 6th, after all the tell me stories from his former people who work for him, his just sometimes outrageous statements, you just thought he wouldn't be there. But what amazed me is how effective the Democrats were in reelecting Donald Trump.
in the circular firing squad of the Democratic Party.
Well, and also I think that the lawfare made Trump of all people a victim, and made it impossible for, I think, stronger Republican candidates, Haley and DeSantis, for instance, made it impossible for them to really run against him. And and the Democrats, I don't know why they have this idea that because they hate Donald Trump, they think that they can that he would be easy to beat. Well, 2 out of 3 you lost.
Right. Well, the other thing about Trump, which you have to give him credit for, is he tapped into the latent anger that was felt by the middle class and, surprisingly, the younger generation who felt like they were being cheated out of a future or even out of a present of being able to make a living and to be able to be economically successful. He tapped into that and in a very dramatic way, I think, beat the Democrats.
I agree. And I think that, one of the biggest problems the Democrats have, I think, is they refuse to accept that people voted for Donald Trump, maybe because not that they liked him, but that he was an alternative that they felt they could go to. And, calling people fascists, Nazis, racists because they disagree with you is not a good political strategy.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you should say that, though. The drama that accompanies Trump plays into the over polarization of social media.
Yes.
Right. So if you look at what people like to listen to or watch on social media, they like watching extreme behavior on social media. Anything other than extreme behavior doesn't really register. So the mainstream media, which has been normally has the responsibility of providing facts, is just being ignored. Well, they're trying very hard to provide facts, but nobody's listening.
Well, I disagree completely. I mean, the mainstream media is not interested in facts. As I tell my class at Chapman, it's not sins of commission. It's not, fake news. It's what they don't report. For instance, recently there was this big outage in Spain and Portugal, and almost everyone knows it's, over-reliance on renewables creates these problems. It gets left out. I see.
The story gets buried, or the reason for the story gets buried.
Also, I mean, if you take an organization like AP, when I was a reporter, AP was kind of boring, but you never thought of a bias issue with AP. Mm-hmm. I guess the idea was, just the facts, ma'am. And AP is now funded by all the progressive foundations. Yeah. I mean, Wikipedia can't be taken seriously. NPR hopefully will be disfunded. When what I think has happened over the last 10 years is the mainstream media has completely lost its credibility with 50-60% of the population. And
so who does have the responsibility and is carrying out of providing facts to people other than you and I, of course, but who in society really is taking up that cudgel?
Well, first of all, there are individual writers who write for all sorts of publications, sometimes liberal, sometimes conservative. I think that you really now have to go increasingly into the main, into the basic data. That's why, like in the work we do at Chapman, one of the things that we look at is, what are the numbers? Like, somebody will say, oh, everybody's moving back to the city. And I said, really? Okay, then we asked our demographer, Wendell Cox, and he said, well, here are the numbers, Right. And I think this unfortunately, you increasingly have to go into, the Bureau land, the BLS, the Bureau
of Labor Statistics.
Right. You got to go to the census, because you simply, people spin things. And unfortunately, and I know this from a friend who taught journalism, increasingly you're under pressure to basically have that the journalists become social justice warriors.
Well, and you're also you're under the gun to simplify, I think, right? And what happens is you pick a message that somebody wants to amplify because of its political potential,
right?
And you just oversimplify it. The tariffs is a perfect example, right? We're being told that we have this massive trade deficit with China. Well, we do if you just look at the trade deficit in goods.
No, but
when you added the trade surplus in services, it's a different story.
Except it's still massive. I mean, the services just don't have. I've looked at the numbers. There's just no way. I mean, the services surplus is not remotely as big as the industrial one.
Well, and then even within the industrial one, no one is accounting for the delivery of Boeing airliners to China, which, when you look at the cumulative value of those goods, actually drops the trade deficit down tremendously. Of course, China has now said you can take your jets and stuff them.
Well,
but,
they've been planning. I mean, look, the reality is China wants every cutting edge industry and it wants to dominate them. And will do anything they can to get there. So obviously, I mean, what bothers me the most is the United States can't produce even basic things like screws and parts for submarines. And we can't possibly compete if we are completely dependent. Anybody who remembers the pandemic, you couldn't get masks. The United States of America could not produce masks
or ventilators.
So I tend to be far more skeptical and even contemptuous.
Well, you have to admit, there's a real strategic problem. If your military might is dependent upon sourcing products from outside of your own country, that's a little bit of a worry, right? It makes you more than a little worried about vulnerability.
And particularly the countries. It's one thing if it's coming from the UK or Canada. It's another thing if it's coming from China.
Yeah.
And I just think that what's happened is on the tariff issue, which I think is very complicated, and we don't know where it's going to end up, but I think that the coverage has been so incredibly one-sided. The reason I think one of the reasons I think Trump is having some problems is the part of the media that business people read, like the FT or
Wall Street
Journal, are so doggedly free trade,
uber libertarian.
Yeah, I mean they. And the bottom line is, and this goes back to the theme of the whole series, things that work out well for your fellow graduates at Harvard School of Business, it's been great. For the vast majority, it's not been great.
Right.
And the great danger that and this is something we've repeatedly gone to, is the great danger is that a small group of people benefit from these policies. And not so, it includes the a large part of the professional class. Most people don't do very well from this. And I think that this is what propelled Donald Trump. And I think it's what it's, again, it's almost like your different languages, like, oh, wow, Apple is getting royalties for its software. Great. That helps about 1% of the population.
The investors in Apple, right?
Right, and increasingly, I think that we're going to see more and more of the innovation coming from China and India and countries like that.
Well, which is a natural evolution, actually, right? Not whether or not whether China stole our intellectual property to get there, or whether or not they're developing it and coming to the same insights. Typically, as countries develop, they increase the sophistication of their R&D.
And the history is, because I remember this, we're old enough, unfortunately, to remember when the big threat was Japan. If you give up your industrial base, eventually the research and development part, I mean, the only place where the U.S. has been able to stay ahead is in completely new fields. In almost every old field, we get our, basically get our clock cleaned.
Yeah.
I mean, you think of the auto industry. I mean, we don't have a single American car company, with the possible exception of Tesla and Rivian, that you can say, oh, wow, we're running on the cutting edge. I mean, where the hell is General Motors and Ford? They're
and the battery technology is actually the R part of R&D for battery technology is coming out of China.
Right, exactly. And so I think that what we're doing is again, Trump is incoherent and says incredibly stupid things. On the other hand, he is saying we can't continue to deindustrialize. I've been following this for almost a half century, and the result of deindustrialization have been very, very bad, particularly again for working class, for the middle class, and increasingly we're ceding the future to China.
So I really want to focus in on this China thing, because I remember one of my favorite episodes, because I'm kind of a China-centric person.
Right.
Just I happen to like the topic. Studied Chinese as an undergraduate.
And like dim sum.
I like dim sum, right, exactly. Was our episode with Ross Terrell from Harvard. And that was really an eye-opener to me, because one of the things that he predicted was, after having watched the U.S. China relationship over, this since before Nixon,
This is somebody who actually interviewed Mao.
Right. He interviewed Mao. Right. Exactly. His feeling was, well, the U.S. will do nothing if China they'll just let them walk into Taiwan. And I just wonder if the addition of Taiwan's intellectual capital to China's intellectual capital, what kind of a powerhouse that is going to create, and whether that scares the crap out of our own policy people, and whether or not that may be one of the reasons why we're seeing such a heating up of the war here, the trade war.
Of course, the other thing that we're seeing is that Taiwan Semiconductors is building a huge plant in Arizona, and that NVIDIA is going to start making their chips, I think also in Arizona. Yeah. So I think that, but I think that there's no question that if we don't do anything with Taiwan, which I think, no American president is going to risk World War III over Taiwan. Mm-hmm. Okay. So, I mean, the reality is, how quickly will the Taiwanese be able to leave? Because you think about the enormous human capital of Taiwan.
Yes.
We've already seen the movement of Hong Kong people. I bet if you went and you examined what was the economic success of people from Hong Kong and the UK, Australia, Canada, US, I bet it was pretty impressive.
Yeah. Well, so from an immigration point of view, your point is we should probably start creating a special class of immigration to handle highly talented people coming in from other countries, especially Taiwan.
Yeah, and of course, the immigration is one of the topics we've dealt with before, and it's a very interesting. Like we've interviewed people from Mexico and and Latin America, and the funny thing is their views are not so different than mainstream American views. I mean, when we did our Latino study, which with Jennifer Hernandez and Soledad Ursura and Carla Del Rio Lopez. I mean, what I found was really interesting is that how conservative in many ways Latinos are, that this idea of this people of color coalition, all of whom, want to, fight the war to get rid of the patriarchy and the American system. Why the hell do you think these people come here? You think they come here so they can live in North Korea?
Right, exactly. And they're buying into the American dream as previous generations have, and it's really testimony to how much richness a culture gets when it has new sources of people that are coming in, which is the exact opposite of what I'm feeling is happening over the last 5 years. The level of xenophobia coming from mainstream America, or at least the America that we see, right, which is in media, it just seems to have been dialed up, and very inappropriately, even though you have an incredible richness coming from highly productive immigrants. You're seeing the xenophobia come up. It's not a good thing.
But I also think that part of it is, and I blame more than anyone Joe Biden for opening the border and allowing essentially unvetted millions of people to come, so that instead of the hardworking immigrant that we need, we're getting those, but we're getting also a lot of people who you don't really want to have here. And I thought that in our show on Mexico, I thought it was very interesting, is they said maybe something like a Bracero program. I mean, at the high end and professional, that's one thing, and that can be from anywhere. But I think that
a guest worker program.
I mean, and I think that, and if you have that so that people are guaranteed decent wages, decent conditions. So some guy comes from, rural, El Salvador, works, for, every year on a farm in California and retires as the wealthiest guy in the village. This is something sensible. I mean, I think that I blame more than anyone Biden for allowing the border to be open and feeding the absolute worst sentiments of people. I mean, when you do have gang members, and you do have people who are, clearly they were criminals when they came, and you let them in, you're going to get a reaction. I mean,
well, what about the people that aren't criminals, though? I mean, I've got to believe, and look, maybe I'm being naive in this. If you were to put a percentage on the number of illegals that have come in that are actually criminals, what number would you give?
I don't think obviously in the sense they're criminals and
right.
they broke the law to start with,
right?
Which again maybe creates more criminality down the road. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that a lot of people are very hardworking, but there's also this issue: do we need enormous numbers of low wage, uneducated workers when our own low wage and workers are doing really badly and it certainly doesn't help people like the whole refugee thing. Is a lot of resentment is coming from Latino and African American communities who said, well, wait a minute, why are we paying for their services when our services are being cut? So I think what I think is done is we've created a situation in which, we've exacerbated tensions, not just, from whites against other people, but against, immigration in general, because we didn't have a control system. People are very scared when there's no control.
Yeah, no, I hear that, but I got to go back on you on this. What you just said was you have African American and other disadvantaged groups that are concerned that illegal immigrants are getting the services that they would have been entitled to.
Right.
So that's looking at the welfare side of things. What about the problem that we have, which is that there aren't enough people willing to take the jobs on the working side of the equation?
Right. Well, and of course, a lot of that problem, and I think Mike Lind, one of our really, who's been our guest many times, Mike Lind makes a point that they don't take the jobs because the salaries are too low, and so they feel that they're always competing against this ever growing number. Cesar Chavez and Bernie Sanders before he went woke, all were making the same point. You can't keep adding huge numbers of people who are willing to work at the low end, particularly given the kind of economy we have. What worries me, and we've dealt with issues of AI
right.
and robotics with Tony Lemus and others, a lot of these jobs may not be there. And, right. if you're developing a robot and I think this will lead us to one of our biggest topics, but if you bring in these robots to make hamburgers at In-N-Out or clean toilets, that's going to have a big effect. But I think one of our most interesting programs, and I think the one we did on AI
with Roni Abovitz and Charlie Fink.
Yeah, and from the Brain Institute.
Oh yeah, Dr. Uri Mao is from the Brain Institute at Chapman.
I mean, the other thing that's really interesting is we're used to talking about immigration in the context of low wage labor, but what about the fact that with AI, a lot of the middle class jobs, the kids we're teaching,
absolutely right. It worries the heck out of me. I mean, the latest versions of ChatGPT 4.1, which just came out, kind of known as the data GPT. I think of what I do in gathering the numbers, as you say, right? I go out, find large data sets, bring it in, use sophisticated software to be able to create insights and charts and graphs. In about a week and a half from now, right? Or I'm using that metaphorically, I'm just going to tell the ChatGPT, go get this data and make this chart for me. I won't have to have
and you go skills. Smoke a cigar.
Right, exactly. Well, that's going to kind of drop the value of what I do substantially.
And it's and the other problem, my biggest problem, which we didn't get to too much, which is at a point, I think we'll have an entire generation who has stopped learning how to think.
Right.
Because every time they have a question, they ask AI. Now, the fact that AI is
just in time knowledge is not the same thing as wisdom.
Exactly. And they're like, people say, well, why do you read a book? I say, I read a book because I learn all the nuances about why things happened and how they happened, and then I can pull understandings like, how do you make comparisons of the United States and the Roman Empire, which is a big topic.
Well, a useful piece of context to have.
Right. But if you have a young person, this is what scares me the most, is when young people are being taught these things and they have no historical knowledge to counter it. And then the question is, what use are they? If they are relying on AI all the time, what the hell do I need?
Right.
What do I need the middleman? Why do I need to pay somebody $200,000 a year to push a button?
Well, and what that ends up generating, at least in the minds of some people, is a gigantic welfare state with universal basic income.
Right.
Which means it chases away the incentive of success.
Exactly.
And so that's a big thing that's changed actually quite a bit since we started the show, which is, I've noticed, I don't know if you've noticed this, but the Gen Z and millennial students that we've seen, or people that we've interviewed, increasingly are getting angrier and angrier, and the focus of their anger is the baby boom generation. We have somehow stolen their future from them.
Right. Even while we're paying for their college.
Right.
and helping them with their rent.
Well, and who's developing the AI systems? It's not the baby boomers.
Right. Yeah, we're too stupid for that.
Right. It's them. It is they that are doing that. And so I'm sitting there going, what is going on here? Are we moving into a society where nobody is willing to take responsibility for their own actions and their own success?
Or or you get more and more people who are looking for the government structure. And, we have to really be careful that, when you talk about that anger, it really has two predominant streams. One is heavily female, Luigi Mangione was great for killing this guy in cold blood. It's okay to go key a bunch of Teslas. Somehow that's okay. There's that group, and then you've got the group heavily male who feel that they've been
disenfranchised.
They've been disenfranchised. When you talk about toxic masculinity or patriarchy or white nationalism, so what we see that generation, and I've been looking at this particularly in Europe, because in Europe you have a multiple party system, so people change. The number one party for young people in Germany is the AfD, which is somewhat more on the far right side for sure. Young people are, but what we're seeing is young people are voting for that, and they're voting for the far left parties.
Right.
They're like De Link, and they're in Germany. And so and the same thing is true in France. In France, the young people voted for Le Pen on the right and Mélenchon on the left. So there is this massive alienation of this generation.
Well, and there obviously polarization. Right it's hard to do that in the middle. My question about that, we've done some really interesting shows on the metaverse.
Yes.
And the potential of this, not tomorrow, but say 50 years from now, this immersive world where people bury themselves in an alternative reality to get rid of the pain of living in their current reality.
I think 50 years is much too modest. I think you're talking 5 years, 10 years, because we already see it. Like, for instance, people who are on Facebook 6 hours a day, people who are, playing video games for hours and hours and hours. That's an alternative universe.
Well, it's going to be interesting when our avatars do this same show 5 years from now. They'll probably be commenting on that.
They'll be younger and better looking,
right. Exactly.
But
and have hair. They're going to have hair.
Well, some of us have some still. But I think that this alienation of this young generation has got to be understood as both on the left and on the right. What they look at, as they look at the establishment parties, you could say, let's say in the U.S., because we have this two-party system, you've got the sort of common sense Democrats, the us old Clinton people, who are, but are still basically in the mainstream of American tradition. And then you have the old Bush Republicans as well, and those are becoming basically baby boomer remnants. But on the fringes, it's AOC on one side, and JD Vance on the other side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's so, and of course we're at that stage, we baby boomers. We don't have that much time left on the planet.
Yeah.
And so the really interesting question becomes, when do we lose all saliency as a generation from, speaking of baby boomers? It's not too far away.
No, look, you think about the silent generation,
Mm-hmm.
The people who were, came sort of into were born, let's say, in the 30s and 40s, and who, were before the boomers. Joe Biden is probably
right.
the symbol. And the reality is, and look, we have to deal with this every day, is, there's, I do think that there's wisdom that people get when they get older, but there are many things you can't do. And I mean, one of the things I'm thinking about is about how we assign seniority a revered role, but not a controlling role.
Right. Which has been, by the way, the hallmark of other cultures.
Exactly.
Especially in Asia.
Right.
And so we do have to figure that out. That actually brings up a great question that may be a perfect way of summing up, which is, in what ways has our place in the world as a culture, right? Not just as a government or as a country or as a state, because we love living in California, but as a culture, where is it going? How is it changed? Where is it going? What's your feeling about that?
Well, I think there are numerous ways that we can go. One is what we've been talking about, AI driven, people basically, will be, living in their little apartments with no children, smoking weed, watching video games, immersing themselves in the metaverse,
right?
And being completely alienated. I think, that's one. The other side of it, and this is something that we're going to be getting more into, there are signs that on the education, we did a show on education. I'll never forget visiting a Catholic-related charter school in the Bronx and seeing what those kids were doing. And I do think that there's a push. I think there's more people beginning to reconsider religion. I think a lot of people are looking at the life that people inherited from the boomers, which is, I only care about myself. I only care about my pleasure. I think there's a pushback that is beginning to happen. And I personally think that the salvation of the society is not going to come from Washington. It's going to come from local neighborhoods. It's going to come from churches. It's going to come from families.
A sense of community is what you're saying. It's not, and like what you're talking about from a religion point of view isn't necessarily a spiritual reawakening on the individual basis. It's a reawakening of the fact that you belong to a community and that your strength comes from interacting with other people.
And like we'll be doing a show on this for sure, which is, that the universe maybe does have some sort of overarching principle, because why would
so this is an intelligent design argument?
Well, intelligent design, or just to say we don't know, but you certainly. My point is, I don't know, how do the atheists know? I mean,
right.
I mean,
right.
I'm basically a very skeptical person in general, but I think also that people beginning to realize that there are these values that are really important. It's like Richard Reeves has said, that you don't get rid of a 15,000-year-old institution and then think that it's not going to have an impact. If the family falls apart, everything else falls apart.
Well, and if you look at the history of civilization and you think about, well, what is it that has made Homo sapiens so successful as a species? It's really the notion of collaboration.
Right.
From hunting in packs to being able to create universities where you have an exchange of thought, despite the fact that people may disagree amongst themselves. That collaboration has really brought a lot with it. And so if we can have a society where instead of being isolated in your own little bubble, you actually interact with other people on a real basis as opposed to with avatars.
Yes.
Something tells me that there's some benefit in that for society.
Right. And I think that, one of the things we also have done in our classes and we'll do more on the show is, what I call the artisan economy. People, I had lunch yesterday with Shadeen Sadeki, who is one of the, leaders in this area. And he just says, look, at some point, in an era where you can get pretty much everything online, when you go out, you want a human experience. You want to meet the creator of the product, chat with the barista, know something about the food you're eating. I mean, so and
it could be little things, right?
Exactly.
It could be just, a friend of mine, Gus, just made a weather vane for his house. And he did it by taking out a piece of wood and doing a jigsaw, cutout of I think it was a squirrel or something like that. And it took him a couple of hours in his house to be able to do that. But it was such a great sense of making stuff. Right? And the pride that he has in doing that, I think is something that everybody is going to want to have in whatever it is they make. It may be that they're writing something or they're creating a piece of media, from a content point of view, or they're studying something and they're going to derive an incredible insight. The idea that you're making those things is, I think, something that is going to be a positive for society if we can focus people on doing that.
And you see it in things like vintage stores, where people get to, choose a very eclectic thing. Farmers markets, the huge explosion in a number of farmers markets. So, I think, as we have this increasingly, if you will, by design, authoritarian, top-down digital economy, there's going to be a reaction to it. And I think, I think that we hear this from the young people too, that they don't necessarily like this direction. Like, you think about human relations people we've had in our class who would, who say, well, eventually they won't need me because the AI will pick the people. Well, AI doesn't understand charisma. That doesn't understand who is going to be a good mix with your other employees. So I think there's going to be a rebellion against this order. And again, this rebellion will have a left and a right. And the question is, can we somehow synthesize it so that it's not too disruptive and
it won't be Luddite in nature?
Right. That people, but that, I think one of the things that I think's been the reason for the podcast success is we try to deal with real issues and we deal with people with different perspectives. A lot of times we don't necessarily agree with each other, much less with our guests. But the key to me is you want to have guests who are rational, who can back up their arguments and are articulate. To have guests
and who could bring genuine insight,
right? I mean, I think that maybe our last legacy as boomers is the importance of knowledge, the importance of being able to make an argument and to listen to an argument you disagree with. And that's what we're trying to do with this podcast. And I hope we can keep doing it.
Yeah, me too. And thank you for what has been an incredible 5 years. And we hope that you continue to tune in. We'd love to hear your suggestions about what it is that you'd like to hear us tackle. So please reach out to us on Instagram and LinkedIn. And thank you again for being part of the Feudal Future podcast.
The future.